Fighter pilots dissed Single Dad's Civic, then F-35 command called. "We need Ace of Aces back now." They laughed at the old mechanic's beat-up car. But when the Air Force's deadliest mission failed, the same pilots who mocked him were ordered to beg the washed-up dad they'd humiliated to save them all. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Texas sunrise painted long shadows across the Henderson farmhouse as Jack moved through his morning routine. His calloused hands worked methodically, measuring coffee grounds into the worn filter. The familiar aroma filled the kitchen, mixing with the dusty warmth streaming through the windows. Jack's footsteps were quiet on the creaking floorboards as he made his way to Emma's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he paused in the doorway. His daughter slept peacefully, her long brown hair spread across the pillow. On her bedside table, a collection of photographs caught the early morning light. There was Sarah, his late wife. Her smile, bright and warm, in her Air Force dress blues. Next to it, a younger version of himself stood proudly beside his F-16. "Emma," he called softly. "Time to wake up, sweetheart." She stirred, blinking away sleep. "5 more minutes, Dad?" "Sorry, kiddo. School waits for no one." He set a glass of orange juice on her nightstand. Even future valedictorians. Outside, the Honda Civic sat in the gravel driveway. Its faded blue paint a stark contrast to the pristine trucks and SUVs that filled most driveways in town. Jack turned the key, and the engine coughed to life with a familiar rattle. He'd replaced nearly every part in that car himself, keeping it running through sheer determination. Emma slid into the passenger seat, her backpack heavy with books. "Did you fix that clicking sound?" "Almost," Jack replied, patting the dashboard affectionately. "Just needs a little more attention." As they drove through town, Jack noticed the familiar looks. Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store shook her head slightly as they passed. 2 men outside the hardware store exchanged knowing glances. The Civic's distinctive rumble announced their presence long before they arrived anywhere. At the high school drop-off, a shiny new Mustang revved its engine behind them. Jack recognized Tommy Mitchell's son behind the wheel, probably fresh from the dealership his father owned. "See you after school, Dad," Emma said, squeezing his hand. Her eyes held understanding beyond her years. "Don't work too hard today." The small mechanic shop near the airbase was already warm when Jack rolled up the metal door. The familiar smell of oil and metal greeted him as he flipped on the lights. His tools hung in perfect order on the wall, each one in its designated spot, a habit carried over from his flying days. As he worked under the hood of Mrs. Garcia's Camry, the sound of F-35 seconds taking off from the nearby base filled the air. His hands stilled for a moment, muscle memory making his fingers twitch as if reaching for throttle controls that were no longer there. The memories came unbidden, sharp and clear as ever. The mission briefing. The storm they hadn't expected. His co-pilot Mike's voice crackling through the radio. "Hawk, we're losing altitude." The explosion that followed. The investigation that stripped him of his wings, citing pilot error despite his protests about the faulty equipment readings. A horn honk snapped him back to the present. Lieutenant Mason Cole's pristine Ford Raptor pulled into the lot, flanked by 2 other vehicles belonging to his squadron mates. The young pilot's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, aviator sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. "Well, if it isn't the famous Hawk Henderson," Mason called out, his voice carrying that edge of mockery that seemed to come standard with young hotshots. "Still playing with wrenches instead of stick. And rudder?" Jack wiped his hands on a shop rag, keeping his expression neutral. "What can I help you with, Lieutenant?" "Just stopped by to see if the rumors were true." Mason gestured to the Civic parked in the corner. "That your ride? Must be quite a change from Mach 2, huh? Though I guess at your age, maybe it's more your speed." The other pilot snickered, but Jack noticed Lieutenant Carter Wells hanging back, looking uncomfortable with his colleague's behavior. "A car? A plane? They're just machines, Lieutenant," Jack replied evenly. What matters is the person operating them. Mason's smile faltered slightly. Yeah? Well, some of us prefer machines that don't belong in a museum. Like that sweet F-35 I just took up. Now that's a real piece of engineering. Is that why you came in 3 weeks ago about that stubborn left aileron? Carter spoke up unexpectedly. The one maintenance couldn't figure out? Mason's face reddened slightly. Jack remembered the incident. He'd overheard the younger pilots discussing it in the diner. The squadron's newest F-35 had been giving them trouble, something about inconsistent readings during high-G maneuvers. Every aircraft has its quirks, Jack said, turning back to Mrs. Garcia's Camry, even the expensive ones. Later that evening, Jack and Emma sat in their usual booth at May's Diner. The vinyl seats were cracked, the table slightly wobbly, but it had been their Friday tradition since Emma was little. The bell above the door chimed, and the group of pilots walked in, still in their flight suits. Mason's voice carried across the diner. Look who it is, the ghost of the skies himself, probably telling war stories about the good old days when planes still had propellers. A few patrons chuckled, but Emma's hand tightened around her fork. Jack placed his hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. Dad, she whispered, you could tell them about the Silver Star, about the rescue mission in— It's okay, Emma. He interrupted softly. Those stories don't matter anymore. Mason approached their table, his swagger full of youthful arrogance. Hey, Henderson, saw your Civic in the shop today. Must be embarrassing. A former fighter pilot driving around in that heap. What do you call it? Your junkyard jet? Jack met the young pilot's gaze steadily. A real pilot doesn't need a shiny machine to prove who he is. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Something flickered across Mason's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He opened his mouth as if to reply, then thought better of it, and rejoined his squadron. The drive home was quiet, the Civic's engine humming steadily as they traveled down the familiar country roads. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of red and orange, reminding Jack of countless sunsets viewed from 30,000 feet. Emma's voice was soft but strong in the gathering dusk. They don't know who you really are, Dad. Jack glanced at his daughter. Seeing Sarah's strength in her features, he forced a smile, pushing down the familiar ache of lost dreams and tarnished honor. Maybe that's for the best. The morning dew clung to the grass as Jack's old Civic rolled up to the airbase gate. The guard, young and fresh-faced, checked his credentials with a respectful nod. Good morning, Mr. Henderson. Parts delivery? Yes, sir, Jack replied, his voice steady despite the familiar ache in his chest. The guard waved him through, and Jack drove slowly past the long row of hangars. The scent of jet fuel and hot metal filled his nostrils, smells that took him back to better days. A deep rumble built in the distance. Jack's eyes instinctively turned skyward as an F-35 roared down the runway. Its sleek form lifted gracefully into the morning light, afterburners painting the sky with twin trails of fire. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, fingers flexing as if they could feel the old controls. For a moment, he wasn't in the Civic anymore, but back in his cockpit, feeling the raw power of a fighter responding to his touch. The spell broke as the jet disappeared into the clouds. Jack parked near Hangar 7, gathering the box of specialized parts from his trunk. The massive doors were open, maintenance crews bustling around a partially dismantled engine. Well, if it isn't the Hawk himself. The familiar voice made Jack turn. Colonel Daniel Peterson stood in his pressed uniform, silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders. Time had added more gray to his temples, but his stance was as military straight as ever. Didn't expect to see you here today, Jack. Just delivering parts, sir. Jack hefted the box. Old habits died hard. He still addressed Peterson with military courtesy, even years after retiring. Drop the sir, Jack. We flew together too long for that. Peterson's smile was warm, but there was something careful in his eyes. He gestured toward his office. "Got a minute? Could use your expertise on something." Jack followed him into the small office, setting the parts box aside. Model planes lined the shelves, including one that made his throat tighten. An F-15E Strike Eagle, just like the one he used to fly. Peterson closed the door. "How's civilian life treating you?" "Can't complain. Shop keeps me busy. Emma's doing well in school." "Good. Good." Peterson settled behind his desk, fingers drumming briefly on a folder marked Classified. "Listen, Jack. We're starting a new program. Something special. Need experienced hands, people who understand both the old and new systems." Jack felt his shoulders tense. "Daniel, just hear me out. Your record, aside from that one incident, is exemplary. Your combat hours, your instincts. That world's behind me." Jack cut in, his voice firm but quiet. "I made my peace with it." Peterson's face showed a flash of disappointment. "The Air Force lost one of its best when you left, Jack. Sometimes the past doesn't have to stay in." The past. Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Emma's school. He read it quickly, grateful for the interruption. "I need to go. Parts are in the box. Everything you requested." The colonel stood, accepting the change of subject. "Thanks for the delivery. Think about what I said, though. Doors always open." Jack left the hangar, the morning sun now high and hot. Another F-35 screamed overhead, and he forced himself not to watch it climb. The rest of his morning passed in a blur of oil changes and brake jobs at his shop. Around lunch, his phone rang again. This time it was Mrs. Martinez, Emma's history teacher. "Mr. Henderson? I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all. Is Emma okay?" "Oh, yes. She's fine. Actually, I'm calling about our Veterans Day Assembly next week. We're looking for speakers, and Emma mentioned your service record. We'd be honored if you'd consider sharing your experience with the students." Jack's throat went dry. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." "Emma was quite excited about the possibility," Mrs. Martinez continued. "She's never really had a chance to share this part of your life with her classmates. The thought of standing before all those young faces, trying to explain things he'd spent years pushing away, made his chest tight. But Emma's words from the previous evening echoed in his mind. "They don't know who you really are, Dad. Could I think about it?" he managed. "Of course. Just let us know by Friday." When Emma got home from school that afternoon, she practically bounced through the door. "Dad, did Mrs. Martinez call you? About the assembly?" Jack looked at his daughter's hopeful face, saw the pride shining in her eyes, the same warm brown as her mother's. "She did." "And?" Emma perched on the edge of his workbench. "Will you do it?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart. It's been a long time." "Please, Dad?" She reached for his hand, her smaller fingers wrapping around his work-roughened ones. "I want everyone to know what a hero my father is." The word hero hit him like a physical blow. "Emma, I'm not. You are to me." Her voice was soft but certain, and maybe it's time other people knew it too. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jack sat alone on the farmhouse porch. The night air was cool, carrying the distant rumble of jets on their evening training runs. In his lap rested his old flight helmet, the call sign Hawk still visible beneath years of wear. His fingers traced the faded letters, remembering the weight of it, the feel of strapping in for a mission. The thunder grew louder as another jet passed overhead, invisible in the darkness but present in every vibration through the air. Jack closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. The past might be behind him, but nights like this proved it never truly stayed grounded. The sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold when Jack pulled into the Passes, gravel parking lot of May's Diner. His work uniform bore the dark stains of yesterday's oil changes and brake jobs, but he didn't mind. Honest work never bothered him. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The morning regulars, farmers, teachers heading to school, and a few retired folks nodded hello. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air as May herself appeared with a steaming pot. "The usual, Jack?" she asked, already reaching for his favorite blue mug. "Thanks, May." He settled into his usual spot by the window, watching the town slowly come to life. The peaceful morning shattered when 3 sports cars roared into the parking lot, their engines revving unnecessarily loud. Jack's coffee rippled in its cup as Lieutenant Mason Cole and his fellow pilots strutted through the door, their flight suits pristine and spotless. "Well, look who it is," Mason announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The ghost mechanic himself. His friends snickered, spreading out to occupy the counter seats. Jack kept his eyes on his coffee, taking a slow sip. The diner had grown quiet, the regulars watching uncomfortably. "Hey, Henderson," one of the younger pilots called out. "That heap of junk out there really yours? Thought it might have been abandoned." May stepped forward, coffee pot held like a weapon. "Now, boys, that's enough." "It's all right, May," Jack said quietly. He could handle their words. He'd faced worse, but Mason wasn't finished. He sauntered over to Jack's table, leaning down with both hands planted on the surface. "You know what I think? I think you can't let go. Hanging around the base, fixing our planes because you can't fly them anymore, must eat you up inside." Jack met his gaze steadily. "There's no shame in honest work, Lieutenant." "No?" Mason straightened up, adjusting his collar. "Let's see what your ride thinks about that." Before anyone could react, Mason was out the door. Jack rose from his seat, following him. Outside, the other customers pressed against the windows, watching as Mason dragged his keys along the Civic's hood, leaving a long, ugly scratch in the faded paint. "That's enough," Jack's voice carried across the parking lot, firm but controlled. The morning air had grown thick with tension as he approached Mason. The younger man turned, keys dangling from his fingers. "Should have stayed retired, old man. Times have changed. We don't need relics like you anymore." A black Air Force SUV pulled into the lot, its government plates gleaming in the morning sun. 2 officers stepped out. One Jack recognized as Major Ryan Grant, his face a mask of professional detachment. The diner's door opened again as people spilled out to watch. Even May stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest. "Mr. Henderson," Major Grant said, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Rather fortunate to find you here." His eyes flicked to Mason, who had straightened to attention. "Lieutenant Cole, I trust you're not too busy to attend to your actual duties?" Mason's face flushed red. "No, sir. Just leaving, sir." Grant waited until Mason and his friends had departed before turning back to Jack. "We need to talk, Mr. Henderson. Privately." Jack gestured to his scratched car. "Not much privacy here, Major." "Indeed." Grant's companion, a stern-looking woman in a tailored suit, stepped forward with a leather briefcase. "I'm Sarah Chen, Pentagon Special Operations Division. What we're about to discuss is classified under Section 11B of the National Security Act." They moved to a corner of the parking lot, away from curious ears. Grant's voice dropped low. "We are reinstating you, Henderson. Temporary basis, specialized operation, codename Phoenix Wing." Jack's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not active service anymore, Major. You made that quite clear 5 years ago." "Circumstances change," Miss Chen interjected. "Your experience with the X-47 program is unique. We need your expertise for this mission." "And if I refuse?" Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We both know you won't. Not when you understand what's at stake." He pulled a folder from the briefcase. "Your reinstatement papers, temporary clearance, full benefits. Sign now, and we'll brief you at 0800 tomorrow." Jack took the folder, its weight familiar in his hands. 5 years of civilian life, of quiet mornings and simple work, hung in the balance. He thought of Emma, of promises made and kept, But then he saw her, standing in the diner doorway. His daughter's face shone with pride and excitement, her eyes bright with possibility. She gave him a small nod, and in that moment, he knew his answer. Turning back to Grant, Jack's jaw tightened as he looked toward the departing pilot's cars in the distance. Looks like the old man's wings still fit. He took the offered pen and signed his name, the scratching of ink on paper echoing the scratch on his car. From her spot near the diner, Emma watched the scene unfold. Her heart swelled with awe as she saw her father stand taller, his shoulders squaring with a purpose she hadn't seen in years. The morning sun caught his silver hair, and for a moment she saw him as he must have looked in his prime. Not just her dad who fixed cars and made her breakfast, but the pilot, the hero she knew he'd always been. The Pentagon jet gleamed like polished silver against the morning sun as it touched down on the airbase runway. Jack watched from the hangar entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his fresh service uniform. The brass buttons and medals felt foreign after so many years, like wearing someone else's skin. Colonel Peterson stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "Ready for this, Hawk?" "We'll see," Jack replied, his eyes following the jet as it taxied toward them. Inside the private hangar, surrounded by the angular shapes of F-35 seconds, Jack sat at a metal table across from Major Grant and a stern-faced woman who'd introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, the Pentagon's lead technical advisor. 3 days ago, Major Grant began, spreading photos across the table. 2 of our reconnaissance aircraft went down in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Heavy magnetic interference knocked out their navigation systems. We've got 4 pilots stranded in hostile territory. Dr. Chen pushed her glasses up her nose. The interference is affecting all our advanced systems. GPS, radar, even basic communications are compromised. The rescue choppers can't get near without risking the same fate. Jack studied the terrain photos. Jagged peaks thrust through clouds, creating a maze of shadows and stone. "You need someone who can fly blind," he said quietly. "We need someone who can trust their gut more than their instruments," Major Grant confirmed. "Someone who learned to fly before computers did it for them." "Old school," Jack murmured, running his finger along a mountain ridge in the photo. "Exactly." Colonel Peterson stepped forward. "The F-35 seconds are the only aircraft with enough range and speed for this mission, but none of our active pilots have experience flying without full system support. That's where you come in." Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. "You want me to train them?" "We want you to lead them," Major Grant corrected. "Full reinstatement, temporary command." The hangar door opened, and a group of pilots filed in. Jack recognized Mason's swagger immediately. The lieutenant's face darkened when he saw Jack in uniform. "These men will be under your command for the duration of the mission," Colonel Peterson announced. "You have 2 weeks to teach them how to fly, like we did in the old days." Mason's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, sir, I don't see how." "That wasn't a request, Lieutenant." Major Grant cut him off. "This is a direct order from the Pentagon." Jack studied the young pilots' faces, some uncertain, others barely hiding their disdain. He thought of his own daughter, of the bills piling up on his kitchen table, of the name he'd carried like a weight since that last failed mission. "I'll do it," he said finally, "on one condition." He met Mason's glare. "Everyone starts from 0. No rank, no attitude. You want to learn to fly blind? You check your ego at the door." Colonel Peterson nodded approvingly. "Agreed. Training starts tomorrow at 0600. The briefing continued with technical details, evacuation routes, and contingency plans. Throughout it all, Jack could feel Mason's resentment radiating across the table like heat from an engine. When the meeting ended, Mason cornered him by the door. "This is a joke," he hissed. "You haven't touched a stick in what, 5 years? And they expect you to teach us?" Jack kept his voice level. "You're right about one thing, Lieutenant. I haven't flown in 5 years, but I've spent every day since then fixing machines that pilots like you break. Because You trust computers more than common sense. We'll see how your common sense holds up against magnetic interference. Mason sneered. That's exactly what we'll see, Jack replied calmly. 0600 tomorrow. Don't be late. The drive home felt longer than usual. Jack's mind kept drifting back to the mission photos, calculating angles, remembering the feel of flying by instinct alone. The setting sun painted his old Civic in shades of gold as he pulled into his driveway. Emma was waiting on the porch, homework spread across her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening at the sight of his uniform. "Dad?" She stood, papers sliding to the wooden boards. "What's going on?" Jack climbed the steps slowly, each creak familiar as an old friend. "They need me back," he said simply, "just for a little while." Emma's face lit up with understanding. "The Air Force? They're letting you fly again?" He nodded, and suddenly, she was in his arms, nearly knocking him backward with the force of the elevate. Her hug, her voice was muffled against his chest. Mom would have been proud. Jack held her tight, feeling the slight tremor in her thin frame, remembering another embrace years ago when he'd told her mother goodbye for the last time. His eyes burned as he whispered, "Let's make sure she still is." They stood there on the porch, father and daughter, while the Texas sun painted the sky in colors that reminded Jack of dawn missions and the promise of new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring challenges, doubts, and the weight of lives depending on his ability to teach a new generation of pilots how to trust themselves more than their machines. But for now, in his daughter's embrace, Jack Hawk Henderson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the lightness of hope taking flight. The morning sun filtered through the hangar's high windows, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Jack Henderson's footsteps echoed with deliberate purpose as he entered, his worn, leather flight jacket, a stark contrast to the pristine flight suits of the younger pilots gathered near the simulator pods. Lieutenant Mason Cole stood at the center of the group, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Look who's playing dress-up," he whispered, drawing snickers from his colleagues. Jack ignored them, setting his old flight helmet on the briefing table. The scratches and scuffs on its surface told stories these young pilots couldn't begin to understand. He turned to face them, his voice steady and clear. "Morning, gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about flying without your computers. What's next, starting fires with sticks?" Mason called out, earning more laughs. Jack's expression didn't change. He gestured to the nearest simulator. "Lieutenant Cole, why don't you show us how it's done? Simple exercise. Maintain level flight through a Category 5 hurricane. All systems down, except basic controls." Mason's smirk wavered slightly, but he stepped forward with confidence. "Child's play," he said, climbing into the pod. The other pilots gathered around the external display screen. Within 30 seconds, Mason's virtual aircraft was in a death spiral. After 3 minutes, the screen flashed red with "Simulation failed" in bold letters. Mason emerged, his face flushed. The sim's rigged. No one could fly in those conditions. Jack stepped up to the pod, his movements measured and calm. "Watch carefully," he said, settling into the seat. The simulator hummed to life, and the hangar fell silent. On the screen, Jack's aircraft moved with impossible precision through the virtual storm. No erratic movements, no overcorrection, just smooth, controlled flight that made it look easy. When he emerged 5 minutes later, the younger pilot's expressions had shifted from amusement to grudging respect. "That's impossible," one whispered. "Not impossible," Jack replied. "Just forgotten." He moved to the briefing screen, pulling up tactical displays. Modern technology is a tool, not a crutch. When it fails, and it will fail, you need to understand the basics. For the next 2 hours, Jack demonstrated maneuvers that left the young pilots scrambling to take notes. He showed them how to read wind patterns from cloud formations, how to detect turbulence before their instruments could warn them, how to feel their aircraft's limits in their bones. Even Mason couldn't maintain his skepticism when Jack outmaneuvered him in every combat simulation, using techniques that weren't in any modern manual. By lunch, the snickers had been replaced by attentive silence and thoughtful questions. "Sir," Mason asked, his earlier arrogance notably absent, "where did you learn all this?" "Experience," Jack answered simply. "The kind you can't get from a manual." As the pilots filed out for their break, Colonel Peterson appeared in the doorway. "Impressive show, Hawk. Looks like you haven't lost your touch." "Like riding a bike," Jack replied, but his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there earlier. "There's something on your desk you should see," Peterson said quietly, then turned and left before Jack could respond. In the small office he'd been assigned, Jack found a thick manila envelope. Inside was a file he'd seen countless times in his nightmares. The mission report from his last flight. But something was different. Between the familiar pages were new ones, heavily redacted, that he'd never seen before. His hands trembled slightly as he read through the blackened lines. Phrases jumped out at him. "Unauthorized frequency interference. External signal detected. Investigation suspended by order of." The rest was hidden behind thick black bars. But it was enough. For 10 years he'd carried the weight of that failed mission, believed he'd missed something, made a mistake that cost his co-pilot's life. Now these redacted pages suggested something else entirely, something that had been deliberately hidden. Jack sat back in his chair. The papers spread before him like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as his mind raced through the implications. Someone had buried the truth. Let him take the fall, end his career. But why? The drive home was silent, except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windshield. Streetlights blurred through the wet glass, each one a memory of that night, each drop of rain a question without an answer. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. "So, they really buried it," he whispered to the empty car, his voice barely audible above the rain. The words hung in the damp air, heavy with 10 years of undeserved guilt and unanswered questions. The wipers swept back and forth, pushing away the rain, but not the memories. Not the truth that had been hidden in those black lines. Not the weight of knowing that somewhere, someone had made a decision that changed his life, ended his career, and let him believe it was all his fault. The morning air hung heavy with tension as Jack strode through the base's administrative wing. His boots clicked against the polished floor, each step fueled by a mixture of anger and determination. The mission file he'd discovered yesterday weighed in his hands like lead, its pages marked with thick black lines that hid the truth he'd spent years searching for. Colonel Peterson's office door was open, but Jack knocked anyway. Old habits died hard. Peterson looked up from his desk, his face falling slightly when he saw what Jack carried. "We need to talk, Dan," Jack said, closing the door behind him. The familiar use of Peterson's first name marked the gravity of the conversation. Peterson's shoulders slumped. "I wondered when you'd come." He gestured to a chair, but Jack remained standing. "These redactions weren't in my copy." Jack dropped the file on Peterson's desk. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide something. Why? Peterson wouldn't meet his eyes, instead straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. "Some truths aren't worth uncovering, Hawk. My co-pilot died that day. I lost my wings, my career." Jack's voice remained steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. "I think I deserve to know why." "Let it go, Jack. Please." Peterson finally looked up, his face etched with something that looked like guilt. "Focus on the mission ahead. These young pilots need you." Jack stared at his old friend for a long moment before turning away. "I thought you were different, Dan." The words hung in the air as he left, the door clicking softly behind him. At the training hangar, The morning's tension followed Jack like a shadow. He found Lieutenant Mason and Lieutenant Carter Wells in a heated argument, their voices echoing off the metal walls. "You think you're special because the old man likes you?" Mason sneered, stepping into Carter's space. "You're just his charity case." Carter's usually calm demeanor cracked. "Say that again, Mason. I dare you." Jack moved swiftly between them. "Stand down. Both of you." His voice carried the weight of command, stopping them cold. "What's this really about?" Mason's jaw worked silently while Carter stepped back, straightening his flight suit. The other pilots watched from a distance, the air crackling with unspoken words. "Lieutenant Mason thinks some of us don't belong here," Carter said quietly. Jack looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd seen this before, the old prejudices that somehow survived even in the modern military. "Follow me," Jack ordered, leading them outside to where 3 F-35 seconds sat gleaming in the morning sun. "Look up there." He pointed to the vast Texas sky. "When you're up there, what color is the horizon?" Both men looked confused, but answered, "Blue, sir." "And when you're in trouble up there, when your systems fail, or enemy fire is coming at you, do you care what color fire the pilot is who comes to save your life?" Mason had the grace to look ashamed. Carter stood straighter. "Up there, we're all the same color, sky blue." Jack's words carried across the tarmac. "The only thing that matters is trust, skill, and the courage to have each other's backs. Everything else is just noise on the ground." The tension slowly bled from the air. Other pilots drifted closer, drawn by Jack's quiet authority. "Now, let's see that trust in action. Mason, Carter, your flying wing positions. I'll lead. Show me you can work together, or you're both grounded." Before they could respond, a familiar voice called out across the hangar. "Dad!" Emma Henderson approached, carrying a cooler and wearing her brightest smile. The harsh lines of the military installation seemed to soften around her presence. "Thought you might all be hungry," she said, setting the cooler down on a nearby work table. "I made extra sandwiches." The pilots gathered around, their earlier hostility forgotten in the face of home-cooked food. Emma handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, each one carefully prepared. "Turkey and Swiss for you, Lieutenant Wells," she said, passing one to Carter. Their fingers brushed briefly, and both smiled. "Dad mentioned you don't like mayo." "You remembered," Carter said softly, his whole face lighting up. Mason watched the exchange, something shifting in his expression. When Emma handed him a sandwich, he mumbled a genuine, "Thank you," Jack observed from a distance as the group dynamic transformed. Emma moved among the pilots like a ray of sunshine, asking questions about their training, laughing at their jokes, making each one feel seen and appreciated. Even Mason's hard edges seemed to soften. Carter helped Emma unpack the rest of the lunch, their conversation flowing easily. She laughed at something he said, the sound carrying across the hangar, bright and clear, just like her mother's had been. Standing in the shadow of an F-35's wing, Jack watched his daughter and the young pilot talk. Carter's respect was evident in every gesture, his kindness genuine. Emma's eyes sparkled with that special light she got when meeting someone who truly interested her. In that moment, Jack felt an old lesson settle in his heart. Life, like flying, wasn't about maintaining perfect control. It was about finding the right balance, knowing when to hold tight and when to let go, when to lead and when to follow, when to fight and when to trust. The mission file's mysteries still weighed on his mind, but watching Emma and Carter laugh together, Jack understood that some battles could wait. Right now, this moment of connection, of barriers breaking down and understanding growing, was what mattered most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airbase as Jack stood before his squadron in the briefing room. The air hummed with anticipation, coffee cups steaming in hands that would soon grip flight controls. On the large screen, behind him, complex flight patterns danced in digital blue. "Today, we're pushing beyond basic maneuvers," Jack announced, his voice steady and clear. "Real combat isn't about who has the fastest jet or the newest tech. It's about instinct, adaptation, and staying alive." The young pilots leaned forward in their seats. Even Mason, usually slouched in defiance, sat upright. The simulation chamber waited next door, its array of linked cockpits ready to transform these ambitious aviators into a cohesive unit. "Carter, Martinez, you're up first," Jack called out. "Show me what you learned about working as wingmen." The pilots filed into their simulators, while Jack monitored their progress from the control station. Through the observation window, he watched their hands move across the controls with growing confidence. On the main screen, digital aircraft wove through virtual skies. "Check your 6, Martinez." Carter's voice crackled through the comm. "Bogey, coming in hot." Jack nodded, approvingly as Martinez executed a perfect defensive spiral. They were learning, adapting to his old-school techniques while incorporating their modern training. After several rounds, Mason stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Sir, request permission for a one-on-one simulation." He paused, then added, "Against you." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Mason's reputation as the base's top pilot. Jack studied the younger man's face, seeing not just challenge there, but genuine curiosity. "Granted, Lieutenant," Jack replied, removing his jacket. His shoulder twinged, an old injury reminder. But he ignored it. They settled into adjacent simulators, the capsules humming to life around them. Through the virtual canopy, Jack saw the pristine digital sky. His hands wrapped around the controls, muscle memory from countless missions flooding back. Parameters set for advanced combat simulation. The computer announced, "Engagement, beginning in 3, 2, 1. Mason struck first, his virtual F-35 screaming in from high altitude. Jack rolled right, letting muscle memory guide him through a series of defensive maneuvers. The younger pilot was good, exceptionally good, but Jack could read his patterns. "Nice try, Lieutenant," Jack commented as he slipped behind Mason's 6. "But you're thinking too much about what the computer says you should do." Mason dove hard, attempting to shake him. "With all due respect, sir, computers don't make mistakes." "No," Jack agreed, staying right with him. "But they don't have instincts either." The dogfight continued, their virtual jets dancing through digital clouds. Mason executed textbook-perfect maneuvers, but Jack countered each one with techniques born from real combat experience. When Mason went high, Jack went low. When Mason accelerated, Jack decelerated, unexpectedly. Finally, Jack saw his opening. As Mason completed a tight turn, Jack cut inside his flight path, positioning himself perfectly for a kill shot. The simulation froze, red letters flashing "Engagement complete" across their screens. When they emerged from the simulators, Mason's face was flushed with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "I've never seen anyone fly like that, sir," he admitted. "It's like you knew what I was going to do before I did it." Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Because I've been where you are, Lieutenant. Hungry to prove yourself. Trusting in technology." He gestured to the other pilots gathering around. "But up there, it's not about proving anything. It's about bringing everyone home." The rest of the day's training carried a different energy. The cocky edges had softened, replaced by genuine respect and eagerness to learn. Even Mason stayed after hours, asking questions about Jack's combat experiences. That evening, Jack's old Civic pulled into his driveway just as the Texas sun painted the sky orange. The house lights were on. Emma was home from her study group. As he walked in, the smell of pasta filled the air. "Dad, Emma called from the kitchen. "I made Mom's spaghetti recipe." Jack found her stirring a pot of sauce, her mother's worn cookbook propped open on the counter. "You didn't have to cook, sweetheart." "I wanted to," she smiled. "Besides, you looked happy this morning. Like the old you. I thought we should celebrate." They sat at their small kitchen table, the same one where they'd shared so many quiet meals over the years. But tonight was different. Emma told stories about school, about her friends, about the history project she was working on. Jack found himself sharing flying stories he hadn't told in years. And then he chuckled, twirling spaghetti on his fork. Your mother radioed in and said, "If you scratch that plane, Jack Henderson, you're sleeping on the couch for a month." Emma's laughter filled the kitchen, bright and clear. Mom was always the sensible one, wasn't she? She sure was. Jack smiled, the memory warming him rather than hurting like it usually did. Later, as he tucked Emma into bed, something he still did, even though she was 16. She caught his hand. "Dad, you're shaking." Jack tried to pull away, but she held on, concern filling her eyes. His fingers trembled slightly. An old injury from the crash that had ended his career. The days flying, even in simulation, had aggravated it. "It's nothing, sweetheart," he assured her. "Just tired from training." "Promise you're being careful?" she asked, her voice small. "I know you're doing this partly for me, but—" "Hey," he sat on the edge of her bed. "I'm doing this because it's right, and I promise I'm being careful." Emma nodded, finally letting go of his hand. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, kiddo." He kissed her forehead and turned out the light. In his bedroom, Jack sat on the edge of his bed, massaging his aching wrist. The tremors weren't bad yet, but they were a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he still had to lose. He looked at the old photo of himself and his wife on the nightstand. "One more mission," he whispered to himself. "Then I'm done." The base chapel stood quiet in the early afternoon sun, its stained glass windows casting colored shadows across the empty pews. Jack's footsteps echoed softly as he walked down the center aisle, his shoulders heavy with memories. The familiar scent of wood polish and old hymnals filled the air. At the front, a rack of prayer candles flickered softly. Jack's calloused hands trembled slightly as he picked up a long matchstick. He lit it, touching the flame to a fresh candle. The tiny light danced, casting shadows that reminded him of cockpit instruments glowing in the dark. "This one's for you, Mike," he whispered, watching the flame steady itself. His co-pilot's face flashed in his mind, young, confident, always ready with a joke. Now, forever frozen in time. The chapel door creaked open behind him. Colonel Peterson's familiar footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. Jack didn't turn around. "Thought I might find you here," Peterson said, his voice low and careful. He stood beside Jack, hands clasped behind his back, both men watching the candle flame. "Old habits die hard, don't they? Some things shouldn't die at all," Jack replied, his eyes fixed on the light. "Like the truth." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Drop the past, Jack. Command's watching." His tone carried a warning edge. "This mission needs your focus, your complete focus." Jack finally turned to face his old friend. Peterson's face showed strain around the eyes, the kind that came from carrying secrets too long. "Is that why the Pentagon sent their watchdog? To make sure I stay focused?" "Don't go there," Peterson said sharply. Then softer. "Please, for your own good." "My own good?" Jack's laugh was hollow. "Like the good that got Mike killed?" Peterson glanced around the empty chapel nervously. "These walls have ears, Jack. Always have." The tension hung between them like smoke. Jack studied Peterson's face, the man who'd once been his commanding officer, who'd testified at the inquiry that grounded him. Something in his old friend's eyes spoke of guilt, of compromises made in dark rooms with stars on shoulders. "You know something?" Jack said quietly. "About what really happened that night." Peterson's silence was answer enough. He straightened his uniform and headed for the door, pausing halfway down the aisle. "Stay focused on the mission, Jack. Some graves are better left undisturbed." The chapel door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving Jack alone with the flickering candle and his growing suspicions. Later that evening, Jack's house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the heating system. He sat at the kitchen table, reviewing flight plans, when Emma's voice cut through the silence. "Dad?" He looked up to find her standing in the doorway, holding something in her hands. His heart stopped when he recognized the weathered paper, a letter he'd kept hidden in his uniform jacket for years. "Emma, where did you—" "I was doing laundry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It fell out when I moved your jacket." She held up the declassified document, its official stamps faded but still visible. "It says Mike reported equipment failures before the crash, but in the official report put it away," Jack said sharply, standing up. "That's not for you to read." "They blamed him," Emma pressed on, her eyes filling with tears. "They said he panicked, but this proves he knew something was wrong with the plane." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Emma, please. You taught me to stand for truth." "Dad," she said, her voice rising, "you always said honesty matters more than anything. Why won't you fight for Mike's name? Why won't you tell what really happened?" Jack reached for the letter, but Emma pulled back, clutching it to her chest. The kitchen light cast harsh shadows across their faces as father and daughter faced each other across a gulf of secrets. "You don't understand," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "There are things you can't know. I understand that my father is hiding from the truth." Emma's words hit him like physical blows. "The man who taught me to never back down from what's right is just giving up." "I'm not giving up," Jack's voice cracked. "I'm protecting what matters." "What matters more than the truth?" Emma demanded. Jack gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Years of carefully contained grief and rage threatened to spill over. "You want to know why I won't fight?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because the last time I did, my best friend died." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's hands lowered, the letter dropping forgotten to her side. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Jack moved to the window, staring out at the dark sky. The stars were hidden behind clouds, just like that night. His reflection looked back at him, haunted and tired, because the truth got my best friend killed. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history and pain. Through the window's reflection, he could see Emma standing behind him, the letter now crumpled in her trembling hands, waiting for more. But that was all he could give her. That was all he dared to say. Gray clouds loomed over the airbase as the pilots gathered in the briefing room. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under their tired eyes. Jack stood at attention, his weathered flight suit a stark contrast to the crisp uniforms of the younger pilots around him. Colonel Peterson pointed to the weather radar display. "Major storm system moving in from the northwest. Visibility will be compromised, and we're expecting severe turbulence at all altitudes." He paused, glancing at the Pentagon representative who stood stone-faced in the corner. "However, Command insists we proceed with today's training exercise." Mason shifted in his seat, exchanging worried looks with Carter. The room filled with uneasy murmurs. "Sir," Jack spoke up, his voice steady but concerned, "those conditions look dangerous for our less experienced pilots." The Pentagon representative stepped forward. "Time isn't a luxury we have, Henderson. These men need to be ready." Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded respectfully. He'd seen that look before. the one that valued mission completion over pilot safety. Within the hour, 4 F-35 seconds thundered into the darkening sky. Jack watched from the control tower, his hands gripping the radio console. The winds had picked up considerably, whipping across the runway with growing force. "Tower, this is Lightning 2. Carter's voice crackled through the radio. "Experiencing heavy turbulence at Angels 20. "Copy that, Lightning 2, Jack responded. "Maintain heading and reduce speed." The storm grew fiercer. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the massive wall of clouds ahead. Through the tower windows, Jack could barely make out the jet's running lights against the gray backdrop. Suddenly, Carter's voice burst through, tight with panic. "Mayday, mayday! Primary systems failing! Losing control!" Jack leaned forward, watching Carter's F-35 wobble dangerously. "Lightning 2, switch to manual override. Repeat, switch to manual. Negative, controls not responding." The fear in Carter's voice was raw. "She's spinning, sir." Without hesitation, Jack sprinted from the tower. The Pentagon representative shouted after him, "Henderson, stand down, that's an order." Jack ignored him, racing toward the backup trainer jet they kept ready. His heart pounded as he climbed into the cockpit, muscle memory taking over as he started the engines. The control tower erupted with protests over his radio. "Lieutenant Wells, this is Hawk," Jack called out, taxiing to the runway. "I'm coming up. Listen carefully to my voice." The trainer jet lifted off, fighting against the violent winds. Jack could see Carter's F-35 now, spinning in a dangerous spiral descent. Warning lights flashed across his own instrument panel as turbulence rattled the aircraft. "Carter, look at your backup gauge panel, the one we practiced with." Jack's voice remained calm despite the chaos. "Find the manual trim switch." I can't focus." Carter's breathing was rapid. "Everything's spinning." "Yes, you can, son." Jack pushed his jet closer, ignoring the rain pelting his canopy. "Remember what I taught you. Feel the aircraft. She's trying to help you." Through the storm, Jack watched as Carter's hands moved across his controls. The F-35's spin began to slow. "That's it," Jack encouraged. "Small corrections, like landing your daddy's crop duster." Carter's breathing steadied. "How did you know about?" "You told Emma, remember? Now push that nose down, Gentle. Let gravity help you." Gradually, Carter regained control. The F-35 leveled out, though it still shuddered in the wind. Jack stayed close, guiding him through the landing sequence. When both aircraft finally touched down, the entire base seemed to exhale. Emergency crews swarmed the runway. Carter stumbled from his cockpit, legs shaking. He grabbed Jack in a fierce embrace as soon as he climbed down. "You saved my life, sir!" The moment was short-lived. Colonel Peterson marched across the tarmac, his face thunderous. "Henderson! My office! Now!" Inside Peterson's office, the Pentagon representative paced like a caged animal. "Absolute insubordination. You directly disobeyed orders." With all due respect, Jack stood at attention, rain still dripping from his flight suit. "I wasn't about to watch a good pilot die when I could prevent it." The mission parameters were clear. "Sir!" Mason's voice cut through as he burst into the office. The young pilot's usual arrogance was gone, replaced by fierce determination. Lieutenant Wells would be dead if not for Captain Henderson. "This isn't your concern, Lieutenant Cole," Peterson warned. "Actually, sir, it is." Mason stood straighter. "We've been wrong about the captain. All of us. He just proved that experience trumps technology every time. And he showed more courage in 5 minutes than most show in their entire careers." The Pentagon representative opened his mouth to object, but Mason continued. "If you're going to reprimand him, you'll have to reprimand me, too. Because next time, I'll do exactly what he did." Silence filled the office. Peterson looked between them, then sighed. "Lieutenant Cole, Wait outside." After Mason left, he turned to Jack. "The lieutenant's right about one thing. You did save Wells's life. But this kind of cowboy stunt can't happen again. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Jack's voice was firm. "As long as my pilots' lives come first." Outside the office, Mason waited. The younger pilot's expression had changed, the mockery replaced by genuine respect. "Sir, I was wrong about you. We all were." Jack studied him for a moment, then offered his hand. "We learn from our mistakes, Lieutenant. That's what makes us better pilots. And better men." Mason shook his hand firmly. From down the hall, they could hear other pilots gathering, their voices filled with excitement as Carter retold the story of his rescue. The storm outside began to clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds. The Pentagon's temporary office gleamed with polished brass and crisp flags. Major Grant sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm as Jack entered. Morning sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the room. "Have a seat, Henderson," Grant said, his voice smooth as oil. He adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform and smiled without warmth. "I trust you're finding your way back into the cockpit?" Jack remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "What's this about, sir?" Grant's smile tightened. He pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer and let it fall with a heavy thud. "Operation Blackwing. Your last mission." He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with black redaction marks. "There are some concerns about your renewed interest in certain classified matters. My co-pilot died that day," Jack said quietly. "I have a right to know why." "Rights?" Grant's laugh was sharp and cold. "Let me be clear, Henderson. That mission file stays sealed if you continue digging." He leaned forward, all pretense of friendliness gone. "I'll make sure you face charges. Dishonorable discharge. Your daughter's future? Gone." Jack's jaw clenched. The threat hung in the air like smoke. "We're done here," Grant said, closing the folder. "Focus on training your pilots. Leave the past where it belongs." Jack turned without saluting and walked out. His boots echoed down the empty hallway as anger burned in his chest. The morning sun felt too bright, too harsh, as he stepped outside. His old Honda waited in the parking lot, a humble reminder of how far he'd fallen. The drive home was a blur of thoughts and memories. His co-pilot's last words crackled in his mind like static. Something about the mission hadn't added up then, and it still didn't now. But Emma's face filled his thoughts. Her future meant everything. The house was quiet when he pulled up. Too quiet. "Emma?" he called out, pushing open the front door. "Honey, I'm home." No answer. He found her in the kitchen, crumpled on the floor like a broken bird. Her school books were scattered around her, a glass of water shattered nearby, its contents spreading across the linoleum. "Emma." Jack's heart stopped. He dropped to his knees, cradling her head. Her skin felt clammy, her breathing shallow. "Baby, wake up. Please, wake up." Her eyelids fluttered. "Daddy?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't feel good." The emergency room was chaos, nurses rushing, monitors beeping, doctors speaking in clipped tones. Jack paced the waiting room, his flight jacket still on, his hands shaking as he tried to fill out endless forms. Hours crawled by. The storm outside grew stronger, rain lashing against the windows like bullets. Finally, a doctor appeared, her face grave. "Mr. Henderson?" She gestured to a quiet corner. "We've found something concerning in Emma's tests. She has a congenital heart defect, one that requires immediate surgical intervention." The words hit him like physical blows. "But she's always been healthy. These conditions can remain hidden for years," the doctor explained gently. "The surgery is complex and expensive. Without insurance coverage, She left the sentence hanging. Jack's mind raced. His mechanic's salary wouldn't cover it. The military insurance from his reinstatement hadn't kicked in yet. And now, with Grant's threats, they let him see Emma after she was settled in a room. She looked so small, in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines. Her brave smile broke his heart. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I ruined your training day." Jack took her hand, careful of the IV lines. "Hey, none of that. You're the only thing that matters." Thunder crashed outside, and Emma jumped slightly. "Will you tell me a story? Like when I was little?" Jack settled into the chair beside her bed. "Remember when you were 6, and there was that big storm? You were so scared, but then we made that blanket fort." He talked until she drifted off to sleep, his voice competing with the howling wind outside. The storm raged on, matching the turmoil in his heart. Everything he'd fought for, the truth about his last mission, his redemption, his honor, seemed hollow, now, compared to Emma's needs. When night fell, and the hospital grew quiet except for the steady beep of monitors, Jack knelt beside Emma's bed, his calloused hands clasped together, head bowed. He hadn't prayed much since losing his wife, but the words came naturally now. "Please," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll give up everything. My pride, my past, my need for answers. Just let her be okay." He looked at Emma's peaceful face, remembering her mother's smile. "If I have to fly through hell to save her, I will." The storm continued its assault on the windows. But inside the quiet hospital room, Jack Henderson made his choice. Some battles weren't meant to be fought in the sky. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jack's mechanic shop as he sorted through decades of tools and memories. Each wrench and socket set had its own story, like old friends he was saying goodbye to. The Henderson Auto Repair sign above the door had faded over the years, but it still held the pride of honest work. Mr. Chen from the local bank stood nearby, clipboard in hand, watching as Jack methodically packed his belongings into cardboard boxes. "Are you sure about this, Jack? Your shop's been here longer than my kids have been alive." Jack picked up a worn timing light, remembering how many engines he'd tuned with it. "Emma's surgery cost more than I've got, Mr. Chen. Sometimes being a father means letting go of everything else." The sale papers lay on his workbench, stark white against the oil-stained surface. Jack's signature was still fresh, the ink barely dry. The money would cover most of Emma's medical bills, but the empty feeling in his chest had nothing to do with finances. He drove to the base one last time, the old Civic's engine purring steadily, his last repair job. Colonel Peterson was waiting in his office, hands clasped behind his back as he stared out the window at the flight line. "So, you're really doing this?" Peterson asked without turning around. "Emma needs me more than the Air Force does," Jack replied, placing his temporary reinstatement papers on the desk. "The mission will have to go on without me." Peterson finally turned, his face etched with concern. "Jack, about what happened before, with your co-pilot." "Save it, Dan," Jack cut him off quietly. "Some truths cost too much. I've learned that the hard way." A knock at the door interrupted them. Carter and Mason stood in the doorway, both still in their flight suits from morning training. Their faces were serious, determined. "Sir," Carter addressed Jack formally, "we heard about Emma and the shop." Mason stepped forward, his usual cockiness replaced by genuine respect. "You can't just walk away from this, sir. Not now." "I don't have a choice," Jack replied, his voice heavy. "Emma's surgery." "With all due respect," Carter interrupted, "you taught us that there's always a choice. The right one isn't always the easy one." Mason nodded. "We've been doing some digging. About your last mission." He glanced at Peterson, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. "There's more to the story than what's in those redacted files." "Let us help," Carter added. "You focus on Emma. We'll keep pushing for the truth." Jack studied their faces, these young pilots who had gone from adversaries to allies. Mason, who once mocked his old car, now stood ready to risk his career. Carter, whose life he'd saved in the storm, offered unwavering loyalty. The consequences. Jack started. We learned from the best. Mason cut in with a hint of his old smirk. Sometimes you have to fly against the wind to reach clear skies. Peterson cleared his throat. I can't hear any of this. Officially. He turned back to the window. Unofficially, be careful who you trust. Jack felt something shift inside him. Not defeat, but a different kind of strength. Sometimes leadership meant knowing when to let others take the controls. He shook their hands, his grip firm. Watch each other's six up there. The walk back to his car felt longer than usual. Each step on the tarmac echoed with memories of takeoffs and landings, victories and losses. The hangar lights were coming on as dusk approached, creating a familiar glow that had guided him home countless times. As he pulled away from the base, Jack adjusted his rearview mirror. The hangar lights shimmered in the distance, like runway lights fading behind a departing plane. But this time, he wasn't running from the past. He was choosing a different kind of future, one where being a father mattered more than being a pilot. The steady rhythm of medical monitors filled Emma's hospital room with their electronic lullaby. Jack Henderson sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, pulled close to his daughter's bed, his weathered hands holding one of her favorite aviation magazines. The pages were worn from countless readings, dog-eared corners marking her favorite articles about vintage warbirds and modern fighters. Emma lay still, her chest rising and falling in gentle waves. Her skin was pale against the white hospital sheets, but the doctors had assured Jack she was stable. An IV line snaked from her arm, delivering vital medications to help her heart stay strong until surgery. Here's a good one, Jack said softly, his voice rough with fatigue. The P-51 Mustang, Queen of the Skies. His finger traced the glossy photograph of the World War II fighter. Did I ever tell you your grandfather flew one of these? Emma's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile touching her lips. Only about 100 times, Dad. Jack chuckled, the sound warming the sterile room. Well, maybe 101 won't hurt. He cleared his throat and began reading, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a storyteller. With a top speed of 437 miles per hour and a range of 1,650 miles, the P-51 Mustang changed the course of aerial warfare. As he read, nurses passed by the door, smiling at the tender scene. Jack paused occasionally to explain technical terms or share personal insights, treating each moment with Emma as precious. The morning light filtered through the blinds, creating patterns on the floor that shifted like clouds across the sky. You don't have to stay all day, Emma said during a break between articles. I know you have the mission. Jack shook his head, reaching out to smooth her hair. Nothing's more important than being here with you, sweetheart. The sky can wait. Later that afternoon, when Emma dozed off, Jack made his way to the hospital chapel. It had become his daily ritual, this quiet pilgrimage to seek solace in the peaceful sanctuary. The small room was empty, except for a few rows of wooden pews and a simple cross on the wall. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the floor in blues and golds. He sank into a pew, his shoulders heavy with the weight of everything he carried. I never asked for much, he whispered, his words barely audible in the quiet space. But please, just help her get through this. She's all I have left. In the chapel's silence, Jack confronted his past mistakes. The mission that haunted him, the loss of his co-pilot, the years of carrying guilt like a second shadow. None of it seemed to matter anymore. What use were medals and honors if he couldn't protect his own daughter? A young chaplain entered quietly, recognizing Jack from his previous visits. He placed a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder but didn't speak, understanding that some prayers needed no words. Back in Emma's room, Jack found her awake and looking through another magazine. Her face lit up at his return, and for a moment, she looked just like her mother. The same hopeful smile, the same unwavering spirit. Dad, she said, patting the bed beside her. Tell me about your favorite flight. Not the scary ones or the important ones, just the one that made you happiest. Jack settled beside her, careful not to disturb any of the monitoring equipment. Well, it wasn't in any fighter jet, he began, his eyes growing distant with memory. It was in a little Cessna, just after your mother and I got married. We flew up the coast at sunset, nothing but blue water below and orange sky above. Emma leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. That sounds perfect. It was, he agreed, his throat tight with emotion. Sometimes the simplest flights are the best ones. As evening approached, the hospital grew quieter. The overhead lights dimmed, and the world outside the window turned purple with approaching night. Jack stood by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one. A nurse came in to check Emma's vitals, her movements efficient but gentle. She's doing well, she assured Jack. You should get some rest yourself, Mr. Henderson. Jack nodded, but didn't move from his post. Only when Emma was deeply asleep did he step outside for a moment of fresh air. The night was clear and cool, the kind of evening perfect for flying. Above him, the familiar sound of jets drew his attention skyward. 2 F-35 seconds streaked across the star-filled canvas, their navigation lights blinking like new constellations. Jack watched them until they disappeared into the darkness, their thunder fading to a distant rumble. You fly for me now, he murmured to the empty sky, his words carrying no regret, only acceptance. The jets were gone, but the stars remained, countless points of light watching over the world below. Jack stood there a moment longer, feeling the night air on his face, before turning to head back inside. His place wasn't in the cockpit anymore. It was right here, beside his daughter, where real courage meant facing each day with love and hope. For the first time since leaving the Air Force, he felt truly at peace with his decision. Heroes weren't made by the machines they flew or the missions they completed, but by the hearts they touched and the love they gave. Jack had finally learned that the greatest acts of bravery sometimes happened in the quietest moments, in hospital rooms and chapel pews, in choosing family over glory. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital window, painting stripes across Emma's peaceful face as she slept. Jack had dozed off in his Prado's chair, the aviation magazine still open on his lap, when rapid footsteps in the hallway jolted him awake. Lieutenant Mason Cole burst through the door, his normally pristine uniform wrinkled and his face flushed from running. In his hand, he clutched a small flash drive like it was made of gold. "Sir Jack, we found it," Mason gasped, trying to catch his breath. The real black box logs. They were buried in encrypted files, but Carter, he's incredible with computers, he managed to crack them. Jack straightened in his chair, careful not to wake Emma. "Slow down, Mason." "What are you talking about?" Mason pulled up another chair and spoke in hushed tones. "Remember that mission? The one that ended your career? The official logs were doctored. We found the originals." His eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and triumph. "They lied about everything, sir. Your co-pilot's death, the equipment failure, it was all covered up to protect some high-ranking officials who cut corners on maintenance schedules." Jack's hands began to shake. 10 years of guilt, of questioning every decision he'd made that day, crashed over him like a wave. "Let me see," he whispered. Mason pulled out his laptop and inserted the drive. The screen filled with lines of flight data, communication transcripts, and system diagnostics. Jack leaned forward, his eyes scanning the familiar details of that fateful day, except this time, the truth was laid bare. Your warning calls about the engine problems, they were logged. Multiple times, Mason explained, scrolling through the data. The brass knew the bird was faulty before you took off. They just didn't want to delay the mission because it would have exposed their negligence. Jack's throat tightened as he read his own words from a decade ago. "Tower, this is Hawk. We're showing critical engine stress. Request immediate return to base." The response that followed wasn't the one he remembered from the official report. Instead of denying his request, the tower had acknowledged the danger, but someone higher up had ordered them to proceed anyway. "We've already sent copies to every major news outlet," Mason continued. "Carter, Phillips, even that hotshot Thompson, we all agreed. This needs to come out." "You what?" Jack's head snapped up. "Mason, that's career suicide. All of you could face court-martial." Mason's jaw set firmly. "With all due respect, sir, we don't care. What they did to you, what they've been doing to maintain their perfect records, it stops now." He gestured to Emma. "She deserves to know her father was a hero, not a scapegoat." As if on cue, the small TV mounted in the corner of the room began showing breaking news alerts. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Explosive revelations. Air Force cover-up exposed." Jack watched in stunned silence as reporters began piecing together the story. His name appeared on screen, followed by archive footage from his decorated career. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Hawk Henderson, once known as the Ace of Aces, was wrongfully blamed for a tragic training accident that claimed the life of his co-pilot. More channels picked up the story. Social media exploded with support. His old call sign, one he'd thought he'd never hear again, began trending nationwide. Emma stirred in her bed, her eyes fluttering open. "Dad? What's going on?" Mason quickly stood, giving her a gentle smile. "Just some overdue justice, Miss Henderson." He turned to Jack. "Sir, there's going to be a lot of press wanting to talk to you. We've got a team of lawyers ready to help, pro bono. They say your case could change how the military handles accountability." Jack barely heard him. His focus was on the TV screen, where his younger self stood proudly beside his aircraft before the weight of false guilt had bent his shoulders. The headline beneath read, "Ace of Aces. Hero pilot vindicated after decade of silence." "Thank you," he managed to say to Mason, his voice rough with emotion. "You and the others, you risked everything." Mason straightened to attention. "You taught us that being a pilot isn't just about flying, sir. It's about integrity, about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." He glanced at his watch. "I should go. The base is probably in chaos right now, and we've got some explaining to do." As Mason turned to leave, Jack called after him. "Lieutenant? Sir, you're a better pilot than I ever was." Mason shook his head, smiling. "Not even close, Ace. Not even close." Left alone with Emma, Jack watched as more news coverage unfolded. His old call sign kept flashing across the screen, each appearance feeling like a weight lifting from his shoulders. The truth was finally out, and with it, the shadows that had haunted him for so long began to fade. "Dad?" Emma's voice was soft. "Does this mean you're not the bad guy anymore?" Jack took her hand, his eyes still fixed on the headlines that were rewriting his story. "I guess it does, sweetheart. I guess it does." The Air Force Base auditorium hummed with nervous energy and quiet conversations. Rows upon rows of uniformed personnel sat at rigid attention, their backs straight and eyes forward, while golden morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows that lined the east wall. The light caught the polished surfaces of countless metals and brass buttons, creating tiny sparkles that danced across the assembled crowd like scattered stars. Jack Henderson stood in the shadowy wings backstage, his fingers working methodically to adjust the crisp collar of his newly pressed dress uniform, the same one that had hung like a ghost in the depths of his closet for years, untouched and gathering dust. The fabric felt foreign against his skin after so long, yet somehow familiar, like putting on an old skin he'd thought he'd outgrown. The weight of the ribbons above his left breast pocket felt heavier than he remembered, each one carrying memories both proud and painful. Colonel Peterson paced in tight circles nearby, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor in an anxious rhythm. His weathered hands couldn't seem to find peace, fidgeting endlessly with a small wooden presentation box that gleamed under the harsh backstage lighting. The older man's face bore the deep lines and hollow expression of someone who had carried the crushing weight of guilt for far too long. When their eyes finally met across the cramped space, Peterson stopped his restless pacing as if frozen in place. "Jack!" He cleared his throat roughly, his voice catching on words that seemed too big for his mouth. The sound echoed off the bare walls around them. "What we did to you, what I allowed to happen to you all those years ago." Jack raised his hand in a gentle gesture, his palm facing outward. "Sir, you don't have to say anything." "Really? You don't?" "Yes, I do." Peterson's voice cracked like old leather, raw with emotion he'd kept buried for years. Tears welled up in his tired eyes, threatening to spill over as he took several measured steps closer to Jack. The space between them seemed to shrink with each word. "I knew the truth, Jack. I knew it all along, every single detail. And I chose the safe path instead of the right one, the coward's path." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he wiped his eyes with the rough sleeve of his uniform. "You deserved so much better from me, from all of us." The colonel's broad shoulders began to shake as he fought desperately to maintain the composure that had served him for decades of military service. His breathing became uneven, labored. "You never stopped being one of us, Jack, not for a single day, while we were all hiding behind our precious regulations and political games. You showed more real honor in your silence than we did with all our fancy medals and elaborate ceremonies combined." Jack felt the familiar, sharp sting building behind his own eyes, the emotion threatening to overwhelm him after years of keeping it carefully locked away. He reached out and placed a steady, reassuring hand on Peterson's trembling shoulder, feeling the tension in the older man's muscles. "We all did what we thought was right at the time, sir. Nobody had a crystal ball." "No." Peterson shook his head with firm conviction, his jaw set in determination. "You did what was truly right, what was honorable. I did what was easy, what was convenient for everyone except you." He straightened his uniform jacket with sharp, precise movements, pulling himself back into the military bearing that had defined him for so long. "But today, we finally start making it right. Today we give you back what should never have been taken." From somewhere out in the main auditorium came the sharp sound of someone tapping a microphone, the feedback echoing briefly before settling into silence. Major Grant's smooth, practiced voice carried clearly. Backstage, formal and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of honors to a distinguished member of our Air Force family." The rustle of hundreds of people standing in unison created a wave of sound that washed over them. Jack could hear the scrape of chairs against the floor, the whisper of fabric, the subtle clearing of throats. As Jack prepared to step out into the bright lights and face the crowd that awaited him, Peterson suddenly grabbed his arm with surprising urgency. His grip was firm, but not harsh. "Your daughter, how is Emma doing? How is she holding up?" A warm, genuine smile spread slowly across Jack's weathered face. The kind of smile that came from deep in his heart and reached all the way to his eyes. "The doctors say the surgery was absolutely perfect, better than they even hoped for. She's recovering well, stronger every day." "Thank God," Peterson whispered, and Jack could hear the profound relief in those two simple words. Thank God for that. The ceremony itself seemed to pass in a strange, dreamlike blur of formal words and precise military movements. Jack stood tall and proud as his long-lost honors were formally reinstated, his distinguished flying cross, with its distinctive ribbon, his air medal that had once meant everything to him, and most importantly, his reputation that had been tarnished for far too long. The weight of the medals felt different now, lighter somehow, as if they carried hope instead of burden. But it wasn't the cold metal of the awards that moved him most deeply. It was seeing the faces in the crowd, the young pilots, including Mason and Carter, standing proud and straight in their crisp dress blues, their faces beaming with genuine respect and admiration. Their eyes held something Jack hadn't seen directed at him in years. Pure, unqualified honor. Later that afternoon, Jack hurried through the familiar corridors of the hospital, his newly restored medals tucked safely in their sturge. Presentation box under his arm. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter somehow, less harsh than before. He found Emma awake and alert, propped up against a stack of clean white pillows, and for the first time in days, he could see real color returning to her pale cheeks. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, lit up with pure joy when she saw him standing in the doorway in his full dress uniform. "You look so handsome, Dad," she said softly, her voice still weak, but filled with love and pride. Jack pulled his chair close to her hospital bed, the legs scraping gently against the polished floor. He took her small hand in both of his, marveling at how much warmer her fingers felt. Now not like those terrifying days right after surgery, when they'd been so frightfully cold and lifeless. "Did you fly again today, Dad?" she asked. And despite her exhaustion, he could see a familiar hint of mischief dancing in her tired smile. He squeezed her hand gently, carefully, as if she were made of the most delicate glass. "Not yet, sweetheart, but soon. Very soon." His voice grew softer, more tender. "First, we need to get you strong enough to be my official co-pilot. Think you're up for that challenge?" Emma's laugh was weak and breathy, but it was genuine and beautiful, the most wonderful sound he'd heard in weeks. "I'd like that more than anything." She turned her head toward the large window that dominated the far wall of her room. "Dad, look what the sun's doing." Jack followed her gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. Streams of brilliant golden sunlight were pouring through the hospital window, filtered through the glass and casting patterns on the clean white floor below. The rays had formed a perfect, unmistakable cross-shaped reflection, the lines sharp and clear against the polished surface, as if heaven itself was reaching down to bless their new beginning with its own divine signature. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he held his daughter's warm hand and watched the light dance and shift across the room like a living thing, full of promise and hope. The morning sun painted the Air Force Base in hues of gold. Thousands of people filled the sprawling tarmac, their excited chatter mixing with the crisp autumn breeze. American flags fluttered proudly against the crystal-clear Texas sky, and rows of gleaming aircraft stood at attention, like silent sentinels. Jack Henderson stood in his freshly pressed dress blues, his medals catching the sunlight. His hands, usually steady from years of mechanical work, trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. Emma stood beside him, her recovery evident in the healthy flush of her cheeks and the brightness in her eyes. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her father's uniform, a small pilot's pin fastened carefully to her collar. "Look at all these people, Dad," Emma whispered, squeezing his hand. "They're here for you." Jack swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were familiar faces from town, military brass with stars on their shoulders, and reporters with cameras ready to capture every moment. But what caught his attention was the line of young pilots standing at parade rest. Mason, Carter, and the others, their dress blues immaculate, and their faces proud. Colonel Peterson stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Today, we right a wrong that has stood for far too long. We honor a man who never lost his integrity, his courage, or his faith, even when faced with impossible choices." As Peterson spoke about Jack's service record and recent vindication, Jack's gaze drifted to the aircraft parked nearby. There, gleaming in the morning light, stood an F-35 fighter jet. Its sleek lines were enhanced by a fresh coat of paint that featured his old squadron insignia, a hawk with wings spread wide against a storm cloud. The sight made his heart race with a familiar excitement he hadn't felt in years. Mason and Carter approached, their faces beaming with pride. Mason, who had once mocked Jack's old Civic, now stood ramrod straight and offered a crisp salute. "Sir, your aircraft is ready for one final flight." Carter's eyes shone with admiration. "We'd be honored to fly wing for you today, sir." Jack returned their salutes, noting how far they'd come from those first tense days of training. These weren't just pilots anymore. They were brothers in arms who had risked their careers to uncover the truth. As Jack walked toward the jet, he passed his old Honda Civic parked proudly on the runway. The car had been transformed, its dents smoothed out, chrome polished to mirror brightness, and paint restored to a deep navy blue that matched his uniform. A small crowd had gathered around it, admiring the restoration work the young pilots had done in secret. "That's your other ride." Mason grinned. "Figured both your wings deserved some attention." Climbing into the cockpit felt like coming home. The familiar smell of leather and metal, the comfortable fit of the controls under his hands. It all came rushing back. Jack ran through his pre-flight checks with practiced ease, muscle memory taking over as if he'd never left. Through the canopy, he could see Emma being escorted to the control tower, where she'd have the best view of her father's flight. The crowd spread out along the runway edges, cameras ready, and faces turned skyward in anticipation. "Tower. This is Hawk 1. Requesting permission for takeoff." Jack's voice was steady now, all nervousness gone. "Hawk 1, you are cleared for takeoff." "Godspeed, sir." The engine roared to life beneath him, its power thrumming through the airframe. As Jack taxied to the runway, Mason and Carter fell into formation behind him, their jets gleaming in the morning sun. The takeoff was perfect, smooth, and powerful. As the wheels left the ground, Jack felt 20 years younger. The earth fell away below, and the vast Texas sky opened up before him. Mason and Carter pulled up alongside, their aircraft positioned precisely on either wing. "Looking good, Hawk 1. Mason's voice came through the radio, respect evident in every word. "Like you never left, sir," Carter added. Jack led them through a series of maneuvers, nothing too aggressive, but enough to demonstrate the grace and skill that had earned him his reputation. The three jets moved as one through the clear sky, drawing graceful patterns against the blue canvas above the base. Below, the crowd watched in awe as the formation swept overhead, the thunder of engines punctuating each perfect turn. Jack could imagine Emma's face in the tower, watching her father fly again after all these years. As if on cue, the radio crackled with her voice. "Dad, you still got it." Jack's heart swelled with emotion. Pride, joy, gratitude, all mixing together. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emma's courage through her illness, about Mason, and Carter's determination to uncover the truth, about redemption and second chances. "No, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick with feeling. "We've got it." The three jets banked together in a final salute to the crowd below, their shadows racing across the runway where Jack's restored Civic sat gleaming, a symbol of humble dignity that had weathered its own storms and emerged stronger. The F-35's wheels touched down with a gentle squeal against the sun-warmed tarmac. Jack's landing was perfect, smooth as silk, just like in his prime. As the jet's engines wound down with a decreasing whine, he could see the crowd surging forward, held back only by security barriers. Jack took his time removing his helmet, savoring these final moments in the cockpit. His weathered hands ran along the controls one last time, memorizing their feel. Through the canopy, he glimpsed Mason and Carter's jets taxiing behind his, forming a perfect triangle. When the canopy lifted, the wave of applause hit him like a physical force. The cheers echoed across the base, bouncing off hangars and buildings. Jack climbed down the ladder with deliberate steps, his boots hitting the tarmac with a familiar thud. Emma broke through the crowd first, running toward him despite her recent surgery. Her face glowed with pride and joy, her eyes bright with happy tears. Jack wrapped her in a careful hug, mindful of her healing chest. "That was amazing, Dad!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying over the continuing applause. A sea of reporters surrounded them, microphones thrust forward like eager birds. Camera flashes popped like summer lightning. Jack kept one arm around Emma as questions flew from all directions. Colonel Henderson, how does it feel to be back in the air? Jack's response was simple but heartfelt. It feels like coming home. The Pentagon representative, no longer Major Grant but a full colonel now, stepped forward with an official document in hand. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carried across the base by the PA system. On behalf of the United States Air Force and the Department of Defense, I hereby officially clear Colonel Jack Hawk Henderson of all previous charges and reinstate his full honors. The colonel's voice softened. We deeply regret the years of injustice, and we thank you for your unwavering service. Fresh applause thundered across the tarmac. Mason and Carter, now standing at attention nearby in their flight suits, led their fellow pilots in a crisp salute. Jack returned it, noting how their faces had changed from the arrogant young men he'd first met. They carried themselves differently now, with quiet confidence instead of brash pride. Mason stepped forward, speaking into one of the microphones. Colonel Henderson taught us that true flying isn't about showing off or being the best. It's about integrity before glory. He looked at Jack with genuine respect. That's the philosophy we'll carry forward. Carter nodded, in agreement. We're establishing a mentorship program for young pilots, sir. With your permission, we'd like to call it the Emma Henderson Foundation for Veteran Pilots. Emma gasped beside Jack, her hand tightening on his arm. Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as Carter continued. The foundation will pair experienced veterans with new pilots, teaching them not just how to fly, but how to lead with honor and serve with heart. Jack looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the same compassion and strength that had made him fall in love with Grace all those years ago. What do you think, sweetheart? Want to help some old pilots teach some young ones? Emma's smile was answer enough. The ceremony continued with speeches and presentations, but Jack's mind was already elsewhere. As the crowd began to disperse and the sun started its descent toward the horizon, he made his quiet exit. Emma understood without words where he was going, giving him a gentle kiss on the cheek before letting him go. The cemetery was peaceful in the golden light of sunset. Jack's polished dress shoes crunched softly on the gravel path as he made his way to Grace's grave. The headstone was simple but elegant, just like she had been in life. Fresh flowers from Emma's regular visits brightened the base of the marble. Jack knelt down, adding his own bouquet. Yellow roses, Grace's favorite. His fingers traced the engraved letters of her name as memories flooded back. Her laugh, her unwavering support, the way she'd always believed in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. We made it, Grace, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. We really did. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, like the colors of Grace's favorite dress. A gentle breeze rustled the flowers, carrying with it the distant sound of jets taking off. Young pilots continuing their training, carrying forward the lessons of the past into the future. Jack stayed there until the red. First stars appeared, twinkling like navigation lights in the darkening sky. In the peace of that moment, he felt complete, not just as a pilot vindicated or a father blessed, but as a man who had finally found his way home. The autumn breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the restored airfield. What had once been an abandoned municipal airport now gleamed with new purpose. The Henderson Flight Academy sign, crafted from polished aluminum, salvaged from retired aircraft, caught the morning sun like a beacon. Jack stood at the back of the assembled crowd, his hands clasped behind him, watching as Emma approached the podium. Her steps were strong and sure, such a contrast from those uncertain hospital days just months ago. Her recovery had been remarkable, her spirit even more so. The crowd before them represented every corner of their community. Children from various backgrounds sat cross-legged on blankets spread across the grass, their eyes wide with wonder as they gazed at the restored vintage planes lined up on display. Parents stood behind them, some in business attire, others in working clothes, all united by their children's dreams of flight. Mason and Carter flanked Jack, both in their dress blues. They'd taken leave to be here, refusing to miss this moment. Carter gave Jack a gentle elbow nudge. "Sir, you clean up pretty nice when you're not covered in engine grease." Jack smoothed his new flight instructor's uniform, allowing himself a small smile. "Don't get used to it. I'll be back in coveralls by tomorrow." Emma tapped the microphone, and the murmur of conversation faded. She looked radiant in her blue dress, her mother's pendant catching the light at her throat. "Welcome, everyone, to the opening of Henderson Flight Academy," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Some of you might know my father as the Ace of Aces, or from the news stories about his vindication. But I know him as the man who taught me that true courage isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every single time." Jack felt his chest tighten with emotion. Mason reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "This academy," Emma continued, "isn't just about learning to fly. It's about learning to believe in yourself, in each other, and in something bigger than all of us. My dad always says that when you're up there, the sky doesn't care about where you come from or what you look like. It only cares about what's in your heart." The crowd nodded, several parents wiping away tears. In the front row, a young girl in a wheelchair beamed up at Emma, hope shining in her eyes. "3 months ago, I was in a hospital bed, wondering if I'd ever be strong enough to stand here. But my father showed me that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's in a fancy jet, sure." She paused, drawing laughs from the crowd. "But sometimes it's in an old Honda Civic that refuses to quit, just like the spirit of the person driving it." Jack's gaze drifted to his car, parked proudly near the hangar. Its fresh paint job gleamed in the sunlight, the once mocked vehicle now wearing its battle scars like medals of honor. The local auto shop students had insisted on restoring it as their project, refusing payment. So today, as we open these doors to everyone who dreams of touching the sky, remember this: courage isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears with grace and determination. That's what my dad taught me. That's what this academy stands for." As if on cue, the distinctive roar of jets filled the air. The crowd looked up in unison as 3 F-35 seconds streaked across the crystal-clear sky. With precise coordination, they traced a perfect heart shape, their contrails lingering against the blue. Emma's voice grew soft with emotion. "My mom used to say that love is like flight. It defies gravity. It lifts us up, and it takes us places we never thought we could go. Today, I see that love in action, in all of you who believed in this dream." The applause was thunderous. Children jumped to their feet, pointing at the sky where the heart shape slowly dissolved into the wind. Parents hugged their kids, and veterans in the crowd stood a little straighter. Jack finally allowed himself to look skyward, blinking back tears. In that moment, he could almost feel Grace's presence, could almost hear her laugh carried on the wind. The academy was more than just a flight school. It was a testament to second chances, to the power of faith and community. Mason cleared his throat. "Sir, I believe they're waiting for you." Indeed, the crowd had parted, creating a path to the podium. Emma stood there, hand extended, inviting him forward. Jack walked slowly, each step carrying the weight of his journey, from decorated pilot to disgraced veteran to redeemed hero. As he reached the podium, Emma hugged him tight. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered. Jack faced the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "The sky doesn't belong to those who fly the fastest. It belongs to those who never stop reaching for hope." The sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the airfield. Golden light caught the Civic's windshield, transforming the once-mocked car into a symbol of resilience. Jack smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from soaring above the storms, but from weathering them with unwavering faith. Looking out at the sea of faces, young and old, rich and poor, All united by the dream of flight, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A new chapter where hope would take wing, carried aloft by the next generation of dreamers. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jack Hawk Henderson, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.